Now, you may be thinking, why should I listen to this? Or how does this apply to me? It might not apply to you directly, but it can apply to someone close to you, or it is happening to you. You just don't realize it yet. I don't want to force any ideas or traumas onto you. That's not why I'm speaking about this. I want you, the audience, to know what generational trauma is and be able to identify it or stop it. I know it may not seem like it because we don't know each other very well, but I've suffered from generational trauma for years. In fact, it's gone on for generations, and I'm working my hardest to break the cycle so that my future children or family members don't suffer as well. Now, I did do some extra research to make sure that I knew what I am talking about, but I'm not going to dive into that just yet. However, I believe that generational trauma is a real thing and that it occurs within various families, no matter their cultural backgrounds. You can come from any part of the world and still experience this because it's not specific to any race or country. To move on, I will be discussing what generational trauma is, how to identify it, and how to possibly break the cycle. Now, you may be asking, what is generational trauma? Before we get into that, you need to understand what trauma itself is. According to Natalie Boone from Ensemble Therapy, trauma is an experience that happens in an individual's life that creates serious harm, whether that be mentally, physically, emotionally, or even sexual harm. Trauma can happen at any point in a person's life, and the impact of the trauma can vary from each individual. Now, take what we've gathered from trauma and spread it over a series of generations, and you get generational trauma, which can be described as a traumatic event that begins decades prior to the current generation. And it doesn't even have to happen decades prior, it can happen just a generation beforehand. And this brings us into our next topic, which answers the question, why is it so significant? Generational trauma is so significant because it affects the future generations' mindsets, such as how they view, understand, and cope with certain situations later in life. This mindset is kept within the family for such a long time that it becomes normalized. This normalization of trauma causes the family to view the problem as insignificant or not important. Some even turn a blind eye to the traumatic habits formed that they don't even talk about it anymore. For example, Dr. Fabiana Franco from Psych Central explains that normalized traumatic behaviors repeat and cause damage, and that's how these normalized behaviors create a highly toxic and damaging emotional atmosphere within familial interactions and households. I've seen and experienced firsthand how toxic these behaviors can be, especially to a young child, and I know that I'm not the only one who has experienced this. This, however, brings us to the symptoms/signs of generational trauma within an individual and an entire household. However, I would like to emphasize that not every family has the same signs or show the same symptoms because each person has different traumatic responses and experiences different types of traumas. Throughout my research on this topic, I realized two things. The first is the similarities of the symptoms and signs within each article, such as anxiety, depression, PTSD, which is post traumatic stress disorder, mistrust, and issues with self esteem or self confidence. These are the most common mental illnesses that derive from generational trauma. These are called trauma responses, which is what the way that a person copes with what they have traumatically experienced. On the other hand, we have the signs of a family experiencing generational trauma. These can show as truant children being emotionally numb, trust issues, or family members being overly anxious or protective of other family members. These are only some signs of generational trauma within families, and this isn't how they act with each other. This is how they seem to outsiders or anyone else other than who they are abusing. Now we have examples of generational trauma. Again, I do want to emphasize that the ones listed are not the only forms of trauma. They are just examples shown to help you further understand what generational trauma is. The first example of generational trauma is that of a Holocaust survivor. This is an account from an interviewee from the website Hello Giggles. This person, whose name is David Ruff, explains that his grandmother is a Holocaust survivor and how her previous behaviors and cautions from after the event passed was passed on to her children and even grandchildren. He describes feeling indescribably anxious and stressed every day of his life. He explains that some of his fears and anxieties are like that of his grandmother. It's almost like his grandmother passed on or transferred her fears from the traumatic event that she went through decades earlier to her grandchildren and children. And that is unintentional. And said family members are now living with the constant fear of the unknown. This is a clear example of generational trauma that has been passed down from Ruff's grandmother to himself. Another example is one that is more uncomfortable for most people to hear, but I bring it up because it is so incredibly common that it is no longer viewed as a bad thing within certain families. This is of non consensual incest between a young child and an older family member. This is an example of generational trauma because, as I've said before, some families sweep certain things under the rug or just turn a blind eye, which in turn allows the trauma to continue. A child who is molested at a young age by an older family member or a friend is one of those things. Now, this child is most likely to do one of three things. The first is doing the same thing to another child as an adult. The second is transferring the negative feelings and self guilt onto their own children. And the third is being so protective of their siblings, cousins, or even future children to prevent the same thing from happening to them. The first two options continue the cycle of generational trauma. The third is a form of breaking the cycle. This leads to the final topic, which is how generational trauma can be stopped or prevented. There are many ways that generational trauma can be prevented or stopped for future generations. According to Elizabeth Dixon of Psychology Today, generational trauma can be prevented by talking with your children or siblings about your experiences and feelings so that a weight of some sorts can be lifted from their shoulders. I personally believe that this method doesn't always help and can possibly make things worse on the child, but every person reacts differently. Another way that the cycle can be stopped is by getting help from your traumas and experiences so that you don't force the burdens onto your future family. I think that this is the best method because you are working through your trauma and learning your triggers and unwinding why you are the way you are, which may help in the long run. In conclusion, generational trauma is not one single thing. Instead, it is a magnitude of feelings, abuse, emotions put into a broadened category. And what I have discussed today doesn't have to apply to you, but it more than applies to many of us in society, whether we accept it or not. Nonetheless, we have learned what generational trauma consists of, what the early signs and symptoms are, and how a person is capable of breaking that cycle. As stated before, I do believe that generational trauma can happen and it can occur within any family, regardless of cultural background. Because of what you have learned in this speech, or because of this, I would like to advise you to use this information wisely and hopefully heal yourself or others with what you have learned in this speech. I do want to tell you that change will not come easy, nor will it come fast, but it is up to you to decide whether you want to change anything at all.